Hello, good morning. How y'all doing? Thanks so much, David and Creative Mornings, for asking me here today to talk about this theme of pioneer. I know it's hard to follow a monkey hat, but I'll try my best. I thought that anagram thing was really cool too. I didn't realize there were so many different types. I kind of thought my type would be like a Leo or a Virgo or something, so it's nice to know that there's other models out there. So pioneer, today's theme. I would love to hear what or who y'all think of when you hear the word pioneer, and just shout it out. What was that? Soviets? All right. Anyone else? Cesar Chavez. Langston Hughes. I like this. All right, I like this vibe we got going here. One popular image of the pioneer might be this guy in the raccoon hat, musket, fighting large animals of various sorts. Or maybe when you hear the word pioneer, you think about covered wagons or Little House on the Prairie, a show that a lot of us probably here grew up watching. I myself, as a child of the 80s, I spent my fair share playing Oregon Trail, catching that dysentery. A lot of dysentery going around back then. So there's been a lot of, various figures throughout American pop culture that have typified this idea of the pioneer. And these guys again, Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, have probably been amongst the most popular. They've had films and TV shows, radio shows, comic books. I had a fun time looking up old comic book covers. And apparently they've been featured in over 300 different comic book series. And a lot of the titles of the comic books say things like Conquest or Exploits of Daniel Boone, Wild Frontier. And apparently the real Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett were pretty wildly different personalities. But at some point they became melded into this one pioneer character. And Boone in particular was reshaped to fit this ideal of rugged individualism and this larger agenda of westward expansion. And Boone/Crockett was celebrated as an agent of manifest destiny, a trailblazer who paved the way for civilization, who tamed the wilderness. So this archetype of pioneer as a role model, as a verb or an action, has been mythologized and repeated over and over. Oh, and I thought this was interesting, because that's one way to tame the wilderness. You fight with it, dance with it. So what was the pioneer history locally in what we now know as the city of Seattle? Well, Duwamish, of course, had been living in the Puget Sound for thousands of years. At the foot of Yesler Way, leading up to the waterfront, there were a lot of Duwamish longhouses, which were typically about 100 feet long, and they housed multiple extended families. Where King Street Station is now, there was a tidal marsh where Native peoples fished. And the Duwamish people, including Chief Seattle, welcomed the Alki landing party in 1851. And that was made up of folks like the Denny's, Bells, Boren, Terry's, names that you'll likely recognize because we have buildings and streets named after them. And the Duwamish helped them survive for the first few years. But over the next couple of decades, the city entered into this boom period. There was arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad. So more and more newcomers arrived looking for land for homesteads. And so the indigenous came to be seen as an obstacle to land acquisition and development. So in 1865, our very first city council banned the Duwamish from the city by an exclusion ordinance. Then over the next few decades, almost 100 traditional Duwamish longhouses were burned to the ground to prevent them from returning to the city in what is now Queen Anne, Belltown, and Pioneer Square. And these were efforts that were led by the U.S. Army and some of those very same settlers that the Duwamish had helped, like Charles Terry. And some of those settlers also lobbied to deny the Duwamish their own reservation in Seattle. And of those that did not go to nearby reservations at Lummi, Muckleshoot, Puyallup, they were exiled to Ballast Island, which was this bleak parcel of land along the waterfront with no fresh water resources. Basically, ships would go and dump their ballast of rocks and stuff before sailing onward. So for a while, the most disenfranchised people in the city were living along the waterfront in tents. That sounds familiar. And then eventually, Ballast Island even became seen as valuable land, and so the Duwamish were displaced once again. So in the early 20th century, there were thousands of natives who were both landless and homeless, and some starved to death while surrounded by this boomtown prosperity. And while natives were being displaced, their culture was also being appropriated. For example, there was a group of prominent white businessmen that they formed this club and would do totem pole dances. They organized the Golden Potlatch, and that was a way for the new commercial elite to tell their own narrative about regional civic development and progress. And in 1939, the city appropriated the supposed image of Chief Seattle, and it's gone through several redesigns, but we still have it today. And I do want to say it's important to remember that despite all of this, Native peoples in the Duwamish are still here and still existing outside of history books and the walls of museum exhibits. For example, the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center opened in 2009, and that's the first longhouse that's been built since the last one was burned down over a century ago. So obviously, pioneers were not the first. They weren't the first ones here. They were colonizers, and they built on land that was already being utilized by indigenous peoples, just not utilized in a way that was deemed legitimate or commodifiable. And a lot of times the violent acts of colonizers were backed by governments, by policies, and by large companies. And this, really set the tone for various forms of future discrimination displacement, whether it was driving out the Chinese through mob violence, or the forced incarceration of Japanese Americans, the redlining of African Americans and people of color into the Central District or the International District, and I would say including how we see gentrification play out today. So why am I sharing all of this? What does it have to do with me posting a bunch of pictures of buildings on social media? Well, aside from, I think it being pretty crucial history to know, I think that context really matters. And here, where we're on occupied Coast Salish land, in a city that's named after a Native man whose tribe was displaced, and a tribe that still to this day fights for federal recognition, I can't really address today's theme of pioneer without grounding it in that historical context. And that context also helps frame the lens through which I, as Vanishing Seattle, often will document and interpret much of what I see happening in the city today. And let me also preface this by saying it's not my aim to equate or minimize, the genocide and systemic cultural erasure of Native peoples, but rather draw out some similarities between the processes, the language of colonization, and contemporary gentrification and displacement. Because romanticized notions of the pioneer still persist today. Obviously, we've got a neighborhood named after the pioneer, and in its marketing as being the original neighborhood, pretty much ignores the existence of Duwamish who were here before 1852. We still have new businesses opening named after pioneer. In this case, this one's located in the gentrifying International District. And we see pioneerism reflected in language that's used when neighborhoods become more desirable or more profitable, that they're underutilized, or we see terms like discovery, revitalization, renaissance, that appeal to this frontier idea and imply that what was before that wasn't worth very much. So I started Vanishing Seattle in early 2016, and people ask me a lot, how did I start doing this? And I want to show you my very first post, the thing that basically pushed me from thinking about this all the time, talking about it with my friends and family, to basically just starting the project. And it's from a Filipino restaurant that was on Beacon Hill called Inay's, and they had a server and a performer named Natasha Manila, and every Friday she would do this epic, 3-hour, one-woman drag show. And because of rising rents, the owner had to close. So I went for the closing Friday night, the last dinner, the last drag show, and I ended up posting a clip of Atasha singing, or lip syncing rather, a rendition of "And I Am Telling You I'm Not Going" from Dreamgirls. And I hope this works because I don't want to have to sing it. Yeah, she's amazing. She still performs at Baja Bistro on Wednesday nights and at our place and Neighbors and all over the city if you want to check her out. So as you can see, the place was packed. Tasha was surrounded by her friends and fans and family, and it was just such a powerful, defiant moment. And the space that existed at the intersection of the Filipino and Asian American and queer community, just a really special place, and a place that to me was so uniquely Seattle. So I just had this urge to document it and share it, as a way to say, look, this is what we're losing, and these are the places that really matter. So I just kept posting, and it kind of grew from there, and I found that Instagram was a fitting medium because a lot of times, the way that gentrification happens, it's just it's so visual. So I'll share some other posts that I've done in the past. I like to do posts that celebrate iconic Seattle institutions, and they might, they're places that one might not typically think of being iconic or a landmark, but they might have been family or community gathering spaces that a lot of people here grew up with. So bowling lanes, old school bowling lanes, for example. Leilani, Sunset, Imperial Lanes. Anybody remember going to those? Yeah. There's still one in West Seattle, so definitely that's like the last one of the old school ones. You gotta check that out. Or I'll post on places like Old Spaghetti Factory, The Hurricane, Louis Cuisine of China. And people will leave very personal comments about how they celebrated birthdays there, met their spouse there, practically grew up there. This one was the old Easy Street Records on Mercer Street in Lower Queen Anne, and their rent went up significantly, so they got displaced from there, and now it's a Chase Bank. And I'll share with you some of the comments that people left on the post I did about this. Rainier Olympia said, "I saw Mudhoney here in 2005 or 2006, amazing show, still have the gig poster on my wall." Gooey Ducks said, "I bought my first LP here and I was there the day they tore the building up. This loss still hurts." And I'm a Rad Dude commented, he is a rad dude, "I used to work there and napped under the classical/soundtrack section." So I really enjoy doing these posts because there's this kind of collective story sharing that happens, and it feels like it's this, collaborative love letter to Seattle. Also, we'll post on places that are deeply tied to local communities that are experiencing gentrification displacement. This is from Pony, which is a gay bar in Capitol Hill. In case anybody can't read it, it says, "Attention, this is a gay bar, a very gay bar. If you aren't queer or a respectful ally, get lost. P.S. This isn't a zoo. We aren't your pets." So obviously it's calling out a lot of the impact of the changing demographics on the Hill, the loss of safe queer spaces. And I feel like you'll see a repeat of this historical pattern sometimes where as places like the Hill get gentrified, you'll see symbols pop up like rainbow crosswalks, which are important, of course, but sometimes can feel like window dressing when the reality is that queer residents and small businesses are getting pushed out. There's a seismic shift seen in the culture. There's been an increase in violence and gay bashing. This is from a local artist, John Criscatello, who's reflecting and responding to a lot of what folks have been experiencing on the Hill recently. This is a Promenade Red Apple on 23rd and Jackson, which closed recently and had been serving the Central District for 20 years. As a grocery store, and they would do things like backpack giveaways, free haircuts for kids, barbecues in the parking lot. They stocked a lot of ethnic foods that you can't find elsewhere, and there was, just this neighborliness and people checking up on each other that, again, is like pretty rare in other grocery stores. So it was more than a grocery store. And Paul Allen's company, redevelopment company, Vulcan, bought up basically that whole east side of the 23rd and Jackson intersection. And so the Red Apple kind of became this flashpoint for debates around what's needed in the Central District, whose needs are more prioritized or valued over others. Is that massive Vulcan redevelopment, is it going to contribute to the continued cultural erosion of the Black community in the CD? What are they willing to do besides, put some African American art or symbolism on their buildings? And I would encourage you to check out the work of a group called Shelf Life Stories, which were stationed in the old subway space next to the Red Apple. And they're collecting a lot of great oral histories from the CD and from folks who worked and shopped at Red Apple. Also, the Artist Coalition for Equitable Development is this new network of musicians and culture workers and creatives that are pushing for accountability from developers like Paul Allen as they change the face of these neighborhoods. So as neighborhoods like the CD change, a lot of times people kind of think of this as an organic, inevitable process, but you see a lot of intentionality in how this happens, and of course, there's policy that incentivizes it, but I'm talking about even how people choose to market and talk about it. So you'll see long-standing neighborhoods that are described with terms like emerging or evolved or up and coming. And just like a lot of our streets and buildings are named after pioneers, we'll see this renaming and this rebranding of existing neighborhoods. So in the CD, for example, you see new or renovated housing. It's described by real estate agents and developers as not the CD, but as being in First Hill or East Capitol Hill. But I also like to post examples, like positive examples or suggestions for proactive things people can do. For example, supporting small and people of color-owned businesses. If there's fundraisers for community-driven efforts like the Black and Tan Hall in Hillman City, or if there's developments for things like permanent supportive housing for the homeless, like Link's Tackle on Rainier. And I find that those type of posts get really enthusiastic reactions from my followers because I think people are hungry to see that and hungry for some sort of action that they can take. And one example that I'll share with you is of the Griffin and the Sheridan apartments in Belltown. And they were up recently for landmark designation. And they're historically significant not just for their architecture, but also their early 20th century history as a vocational school for women, which was rare at the time. So they played a role in the early female workforce here. Sometimes you'll see developers submit a landmark nomination that actually argues against designation because it's probably easier or less costly if they can just tear the whole thing down, and that was the case here. So I worked with a group called Friends of Historic Belltown. They're an all-volunteer community-based group. They do a lot of work around historic preservation or cultural preservation and advocating for affordable housing for the neighborhood's artists and working class. And so gathered information about the history of the building, its significance, and posted about it, and got a ton of comments, including from a guy named Ben Gibbard, who's a musician. He's a lead singer of Death Cab for Cutie, was in the Postal Service, and he commented, "I rented a studio apartment in the Sheridan as a writing studio in 04 to 05. Wrote about half of our album plans there, including I Will Follow You Into the Dark," which, by the way, that's their best-selling single to date, and they got a Grammy nomination for it. And then a ton of people commented about how meaningful that song was in their lives, or people who used to live there commented as well. So we asked them to send those over to the Landmarks Preservation Board. And they did, and Ben Gibbard did. And a lot of folks ended up participating in this process that they didn't really know anything about before. And then the buildings ended up getting designated. So, and the board said that those comments did make a difference. But really the best thing that happened is that me and Ben Gibbard are totally like best friends, and we hang out, and that's a totally legit selfie right there. Please also notice how awesome my hair looks. So that's the cool stuff that happens. That's been a good reminder that there's ways to bridge what's happening digitally. Although Vanishing Seattle is a social media project, that there are some effects that can happen in real life, and that's definitely something I like to facilitate more of. Because I do believe that what we choose to remember and honor from our past shapes our future, and that we need to take an honest look at what are the values, what are the assumptions that are being transmitted in things like this lasting iconography of the pioneer and the pioneerism around conquest, around capital. If there's anything I've learned from running this account, it's that no one, besides the First Peoples, can really claim to be the first, to truly be a pioneer in the traditional sense. And nothing here is new or undiscovered, but understanding what and who was here before and really knowing this city is important. And I've also learned that there's no impactless growth. So in a region of boom and of explosion, there's going to be someone who takes that hit, who's accepted as the collateral damage. And I'm interested in how we can move from this long-standing narrative of self-interest and individualism to more collective well-being and inclusion. And does that involve things like flipping the script of what a pioneer looks like or what a pioneer does? Is it saying, fuck the pioneer entirely? I'm not sure. Maybe it's a bit of both. But the thing that I do want to do with Vanishing Seattle is to challenge the assumptions underlying the notions we have about progress and who that's for and what that looks like. Because although I do post a lot of pictures of buildings and places, Vanishing Seattle's been about what happens inside those buildings as spaces for folks to connect and take care of each other, spaces that can often help make the survival of communities possible. Or conversely, what we choose to build can erase, exclude, and displace them. Because there's really more at stake here than just nostalgia. It's about equity. So in the spirit of checking any of my own tendencies around pioneerism, that I'm not the first or only one to document this type of stuff or do this type of work, I wanted to give props to some of these organizations. Some of them I've mentioned before, but I encourage you to check them out further. Shelf Life Stories, Ghosts of Seattle Past, the history of Yesler Terrace. There's a exhibit going on currently at the Soil Gallery in Pioneer Square, and there's been a couple films made about Yesler Terrace as well. Historic Seattle, Friends of Historic Belltown, again, the Artist Coalition for Equitable Development. Also, the writer Clark Humphrey is great. And just on Monday, to coincide with Indigenous Peoples Day, there's a new project that was launched called Real Rent Duwamish, and basically you can pay rent to the Duwamish for occupying their land. And the proceeds go directly to the tribe to support the sustainability of their culture. So what's next for Vanishing Seattle? I don't know if I said this before, but it's basically just me. So it's all volunteer, and it's just kind of like my side passion. So I do have some challenges with capacity. I'd say it's just like me driving around and taking pictures, but I share a lot of what other people send me to, because I can't be everywhere, but also I'm interested in sharing other people's perspectives of what they're seeing around the city too. But I'm really excited about when I'm able to do collaborations or partnerships with folks. That's stuff that I definitely want to do more of. Some stuff coming up around the corner, a pop-up collaboration with 8th Generation in Pike Place Market, possibly working on some short films, and then something that I recently started with Seattle Artifacts and Historic Seattle and some other folks on Instagram, which would be great if y'all came to, is we just started doing monthly meetups where we hang out at different kind of beloved Seattle institutions, watering holes. So please come hang out and build community, share your ideas with me and with each other. I'd love to connect with you all and continue the conversation as we work together towards what kind of city we want to be. And that's what I got. So thanks so much. I think it's Q&A time. Do you have that ball that you toss around, or?
The ball, we are without the ball.
Oh, okay. That ball kind of triggers my middle school, like, gym PTSD, but it's nice that there's some. So, is people just raise their hands and, yes?
I've lived in Seattle for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of changes. Some of them are good, and some of them are bad. A lot of them are bad. How do you make changes that are positive, or do you have suggestions on how you would make positive changes to the city, which is growing very fast, and you can't ignore the fact that it's growing, without trampling what exists and maintaining equity for these displaced people? Do you have suggestions for that or ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really like the $64,000 question. Or maybe I should say $640,000 question, which is more like what it costs to buy a house here now. Yeah, there you go, just rent. I mean, I think that like the first thing is just, again, knowing your neighbors and becoming more embedded and integrated with the community, knowing the history. But I think there's some concrete things that folks can do to support the existing ecosystem, whether that's the type of small businesses that you're supporting, being intentional about that. That might involve supporting things that might not always be the most convenient, or that don't directly serve or cater to you or your lifestyle. Also using the power and the agency that we all have, whether that's engaging in advocacy, and local decision-making processes, supporting local nonprofits and grassroots organizing groups that engage in this systemic work, and who are from the most directly impacted communities. So, like Got Green comes to mind. Again, the Artist Coalition for Equitable Development, South Core, Puget Sound Sage. I mean, there's a bunch, and I think this is a super intersectional issue. So, I mean, whether you're talking about, immigrant rights, or LGBT rights, like it's so intersectional and cross-cutting that a lot of these communities are dealing, with the impacts of displacement and gentrification and change that is increasingly inequitable. So I don't think there's any easy answers, but I think that we all are able to, exercise some positive change, or just talk about it more, like try to change the narrative about all this, growth and change, like what's the end game and who is it benefiting and who is getting left out of that shiny, bright new vision. So, yeah. Yes?
So, how would you, with the project you're doing, juxtapose your work against the huge push? It's probably your number one issue of the mayoral election, which is affordable housing. How do you see the tensions or positive dynamics coming out of that push to get more units and therefore rents not being so high? I don't know that there's an answer, but I think your project is probably part of that whole process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sorry, I think I'm supposed to repeat the questions a bit. So if I understand your question, it's how do I juxtapose what I'm doing here and these big changes with some of the political debates around housing affordability and...
The idea is that if we build more, the rents will go down because we'll have enough housing.
Oh, supply and demand and density.
So how do you see your work as that political process?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I struggle with, that tension a bit, because I mean, I've been experimenting with different posts and how I frame and talk about those posts. Sometimes it's just showing a picture of something that's being torn down and providing like 2 or 3 sentences of information about this is what was here and this is what's happening. And I'm not necessarily putting my own commentary on it. Sometimes I will, and I'll have a story about like, oh, I really, this was a place that I really love going, or I, encourage people to share stories about their connections to places, or maybe there's, like a family that lived in that house and what was their experience like as they had to leave that house in that neighborhood. And there's kind of coming at it from that storytelling and that documentation angle, and then there's, what's kind of underlying that, which is the current policy debate that we have around housing and density and supply and demand and development that can get super wonky, and also I don't know how much I want to get pulled into that, because I feel like sometimes it can take it away from the human aspects. Those are things I'm definitely interested in learning more about, and I have my own opinions and I like having discussions about that, but sometimes it feels a little bit like a minefield, and maybe we have a lot of that going already. Maybe we need something that's coming from a different perspective, and I'm very reluctant to just be like, I think there are assumptions about supply and demand are the magic bullet, and like sometimes I want to challenge that and like other assumptions. Basically, the big thing is like, okay, well, we have to look at who's benefiting from this, who can access these new spaces, and who can't. So it is a tension, though. So it's a great question. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, on the side.
How would we know what buildings might get affected by potential development before the sign goes up that says notice of proposed land use? So, for example, I think a stranger ran a story about the Guild movie theater and the Seven Gables movie theater, and so they're closed and there's no sign up necessarily on them, but are they going to be torn down? Like, how do we get information about that? Is it interacting? Is it knowing what developers pull what permits, or how do we kind of try to start to organize before something gets torn down?
Yeah. I'm sure there's people in this room would have better technical knowledge about that than I do. I think the city posts this land bulletin, and you can like sign up for an email.
Actually, there is
Yeah.
there is a site where you can look up people who are getting, I don't know if she can hear me, but people who are getting permits to do tear downs and builds, and those can happen up to 4 or 5 years in advance before they do it. But you can't know until there's an actual sales bill that's been in place, and I can't recall the URL of it.
It's not.
On the website.
It's not Seattle in Progress, is it? Or
I think it's a .gov website.
Oh, okay.
It's like the actual, it's literally the technical permits that they get to tear down and build.
Okay.
We found out that ours is not actually getting torn down.
Oh, thank you.
Ours is
Thank you. Yeah, it looks like you might have a comment on that.
The city of Seattle, it is a Gov website. You can go into their permitting office. You also have to pursue the Freedom of Information Act to get a lot of information, because by the time they hold a public hearing and the council or something like that, you're hoping to try to save a place. Generally, then it's almost too late. And so I'm surprised. It's probably a lot of that information set around saving those 2 apartment buildings that helped because there's such an outcry. But you need to, if you want to do it, you have to be very vigilant to the city government and
Yeah.
the office.
Yeah, so I think that kind of gets at the crux of the issue, is that there's not a lot of transparency and accessibility, that a lot of times people have no idea that this is in the works until they see that notice of proposed land use action sign go up. And that includes, like, I'll just give you an example. So my grandmother, she lives in an assisted living facility down in the International District, and in this area where there's about 5 or 6 different nonprofits and services that are basically for like the most vulnerable members of the community. There's a low-income children's daycare center, there's a community health clinic, there's a library, there's another senior center, and even like the nonprofit folks, the executive directors, didn't know that this was happening, and until that sign went up. And so they identified that it's like, we feel like this stuff is happening to us that's going to impact our community. And what they're proposing there is a 14-story Marriott hotel, which is like this, and the street that is between that and where all the services are, where the ambulance is, where the pickup and drop off for the kids and the elders need to go. It's a very like narrow street, and they want to add a hotel and like market rate condo development that's going to add almost 300 more units. So it's like, I think that's part of the issue, is that people don't know that this is happening, but I'm also interested in what are the ways that we can, when we know stuff is happening, how do we get more like grassroots pressure on that, or grassroots pressure to actually like change the process by which people know stuff. I think organizing is really important, media, And even if it's stuff like, I mean, again, the Artist Coalition for Equitable Development is starting to do some really creative stuff where they've like shown up and done an arts event and talked about what they're experiencing in their communities at King Street Station right in front of Vulcan's offices. So I think sometimes even, protest and public shaming, I think, can go a long way. And with, and with just raising the awareness that this is an issue and people have no idea how the process works, or you need to have a lot of time and a lot of privilege, educational privilege, be able to go to these meetings. It is, a huge slog, and that is, shuts a lot of people out of the process. So, yes.
So it's not so much a question and more of a political statement. Is for all of us in the room, any of our friends, family, how often do we support local businesses, your local stores, instead of shopping in places like Amazon or Whole Foods? Because now they're one and the same. It goes a long way to preserving things. I'm a New Yorker, and so we would always go to local bodegas, our local stores. We're having the same problem. Of course, I live here now, but whole neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, Bronx, Harlem, totally getting destroyed. So that was my little pitch.
Yeah.
Because you said that, I agree. Support your local stores, your local people.
Yeah. So,
pop shops, street carts, whatever.
yeah. So just for the video, it was a plug to support mom and pop shops, and as opposed to some of these kind of corporate, heavyweights, Whole Foods and Amazon. And I used to I lived in New York for 5 years, and when I came back to Seattle, I really struggled. I had a bit of a culture shock when I was in New York because I was like, holy shit, there's like so much money and so much inequity, and it's like, you could just see the transformation happen. And I was living downtown, so like this, was happening very quickly. And so I feel like when I came, part of the reason, it was also to be closer to family, and I miss Seattle, but part of the reason was just like, that was, hard to deal with, and so I wanted to come back here, and then I was like, it's like starting to really accelerate. It's happening here too. This stuff has been going on forever. It happened with the first .com boom too, but it really started to, pick up and manifest itself in a very dramatic way. So I think in some ways, living in New York kind of primed me for, this and Vanishing Seattle. There's a question in the back, I think. Yes.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of bewildering decisions about which buildings have been torn down, and some culturally significant things, and like you were just explaining with the senior center and those services things. Are you exposed to the language and rationale from the developers on why they would do things like this? Do you have any, do you hear stories about, well, this was why they decided to do that? Or is it just a commercial thing? It's just change and a for-profit thing, or what? Do you have any access to the language and story around the changes?
So the question was about, do I have access or understanding of some of the rationale or language that developers will use in their projects and redevelopments, or do I understand it more maybe from like a commercial or profit standpoint? I do have a lot of people who will come and comment, not so, I will have some folks that I think are developers or work for developers, or folks that are very much like build, or like supply is going to solve everything. So I get a bit of that, and it is across the spectrum. Some of it's just like straight up, we're allowed to do this, so why are you mad? Like, it's allowable, the city lets us. A lot of it is kind of folks who believe that this is helpful. Yes, we need more density, the city is growing, they need their projects to pencil, and so it's part of the greater good. I don't have like a ton of access to it. I understand there are practical things like cost constraints or like the cost of rehabbing old buildings and stuff like that, and I'm kind of learning more about this as the project goes along. But I also hear a lot of stories that kind of point to, there is like a huge profit motive, a profit incentive. I think otherwise we wouldn't have so many folks who are coming here from out of state, from other parts of the country, internationally, who are coming here because it's it's very lucrative. Seattle's a place where you can make a lot of money. right now. And yes, we need housing, but it's like the way in which we get there. I mean, I hear so many examples of really like shady stuff happening just with like evictions and displacement or loopholes trying to get around, you know, the usual processes. And you wouldn't really know about it unless, again, you have to like do a lot of homework and be very vigilant and have like this technical knowledge about how the whole process works. So, yeah. Yeah, David.
So you talked a little bit about how you saw this happening in New York, and it's happening in Seattle now. And I'm curious, have you come across cities that seem to have a successful model for dealing with growth? If it's something that in fact needs to happen at the city level, as opposed to the individual efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of some different policies here and there in different cities, like Portland. I think they have something around demolition or a process where you're required before you tear down an older structure to kind of look at, can something be salvaged or moved? But I hear a lot about how they deal with this in Europe, in like Germany and Berlin, and also how land is owned, that a lot of it, and this is just my very kind of superficial grasp of it, but that a lot of the land is taken out of the speculative private market and it's owned by the government. I think in Hong Kong it might be similar too. So that kind of takes out that using real estate as like a wealth building, wealth generating part of the equation. And I think you're starting to see that catch on here, at least I hear a lot of other people talking about it. And there is a precedent in places like New York and DC where they will have things like community ownership of land, co-ops, land trusts. And apparently, the city of Seattle, someone did GIS mapping where it showed all the city of Seattle owned land that had been sold to the highest bidder. When it could have been turned into a park or given for a community-owned use. And I think there's a lot more talk now about trying to pressure the city, the Office of Housing, to look at alternate ways for which we use and value land and public space. Like, why is the city selling that stuff off? Like, can it go back to the community good and for solutions that the community is calling for that aren't just like foisted upon us? So those are a few examples that I've heard. Yeah.
One more question.
Sure.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, okay. You had another question. Yes. One more question. Anyone? In the back? Yes.
So social media is like such a big part of our lives, obviously, especially like you were saying, visual mediums like Instagram. For those of us who are like posting images of places that are needing support from all of these communities, are you finding that there's a way to frame the captions that makes people more responsive, or to think harder about it, or to evoke a larger response?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I kind of struggle too because I kind of go down this rabbit hole of like looking up the history of a lot of places, and I find that fun. And some people also like those fun facts. And other times it's like, you're gonna have, I'm always battling with the character limit on Instagram and trying to like use shorthand and all this stuff. So, I mean, some people respond to that, other people are probably like, too long, didn't read. So sometimes I'll have like a really short, snappy something, or try to inject some humor in it, or have like a snarky hashtag. And some people love them, some people hate them, but that'll get a response. I mean, it's just, I think, kind of like paying attention to what people are commenting and what they're responding to. But I will try to put something in there that has some sort of action or follow-up, or if they like want to get more information, they can glean it from there. So I guess I try to have like some sort of point, whether it's like, oh, if you care about this or you're interested in this post, do this. Or it might be like, this is messed up. You should like go talk to this person about it, or talk to your friends, or maybe do something. So yeah, but it's it's still all kind of an experimentation process to see what resonates. So I think we're out of time. Cool. Well, I'm going to hang around for a bit, so definitely down to talk some more and answer any more questions. But thank you so much again to Creative Mornings and to you all for being here.